Hi everyone, my name's Angus Wright and I'm a research fellow at the German Center for Cosmological Lensing working at the Ruhr University Bochum. And today I'm going to be talking to you in my 18 minutes about a machine learning phenomena known as covariate shift and what that machine learning phenomena means for next generation so-called stage 4 cosmic shear surveys. Now, I thought I would start by giving a very brief reminder for the non-experts about what cosmic shear is. And so cosmic shear is a mechanism for measuring cosmology, estimating cosmological parameters. And the way in which it works is that you take a distribution of galaxies in the universe that are along the line of sight to some point on the sky. And as light from those galaxies propagates through the universe, it propagates through large-scale structures. So you take these two galaxies in the background you can see here, and as light from those galaxies passes through the universe, it passes through large-scale structures, the same large-scale structures here, different large-scale structures here, and the same large-scale structures again here. And the net result is that the passage of that light through similar large-scale structures creates a coherent imprint of shape onto the observed shapes of those galaxies when they arrive at Earth on the observed sky. Now, the amount of distortion and the amount of coherence between that of the distortion between the galaxies is dependent on the amount and clustering strength of matter in the universe. So if there are more pink blobs that are tightly clumped together, you get a differing signal than if there is very few pink blobs that are very dispersed. And therefore, you can use cosmic shear as a measure of cosmology, as a measure of the properties of dark matter over the entire evolution history of the universe. In order to do this measurement, you need to measure four things. You need to measure four things well, with accuracy and precision. The first is which is you have to be able to measure shapes. So you can't do a correlation between shapes of galaxies if you can't measure shapes well. The second thing you need to be able to measure is what's called the source redshift distribution. And it's the line of sight distribution of the galaxies that make up your sample. So the line of sight distribution of the blue galaxies in the background here. You also need to be able to make some modeling assumptions about the properties of those source galaxies. And finally, you need to be able to make some assumptions about how you model baryons or how baryons exist in large-scale structures of the universe, because that modifies the amount of clustering strength that the dark matter has. What I'm going to be talking about for the majority of this talk is this green term here, this mean z est. So why is redshift calibration important for cosmic shear? Well, again, back to this picture, let's make an assumption that this is my cosmic shear survey, again, the world's smallest cosmic shear survey. And what I do is I take my observed galaxy distribution, which exists at some mean redshift z true. Now let's assume that I misinterpret the true redshift distribution or the estimated redshift distribution of those sources to instead be located much closer to us along the line of sight at this mean z est. Now, crucially, when I make that error, I don't change any of the assumptions about the ability to measure shapes on sky, about the background population of galaxies, nor about baryon feedback. However, I do interpret the same correlation, the same signal on the sky. So I see the same correlations, but I attribute those correlations to having come from a much shorter line of sight. And that means that naturally I must interpret that as meaning that there is more matter that is more densely clustered in the universe than is truly the case. And so this is why redshift distribution calculations are important in cosmic shear. So a question is, how do these things get calculated? Well, one of the mechanisms that's used for calculating redshift distributions in cosmic shear is to do what we call SOM redshift distribution calibration, which takes the distribution of known redshift sources from spectroscopy and associates them to sources that exist in our wide field shear sample, which don't have known redshifts. And that association is done via an unsupervised machine learning method known as the self-organizing map, or SOM. And it essentially just performs a classification. It allows us to associate that these spectroscopic objects are associated with these photometric objects from the wide field sample. And with that association, we can then, with some minor assumptions, construct a redshift distribution. And that construction happens like this. So all we do is we take the redshift distribution of our, we're trying to construct the redshift distribution of the target sample, the photometric sample. And the way in which we do that is by taking the redshift distribution of all of the sources which have known spectroscopy per cell in our self-organizing map, and we sum them together with a weighting determined by how many sources there are in each cell in the target sample. And that's it. That's how you calculate the redshift distribution of a cosmic shear survey in very simple terms. This assumption that we have made here, though, that the target sample conditional redshift distribution as a function of color is the same as the training sample or spectroscopic sample redshift distribution as a function of color, is a crucial one, because if it turns out that's not the case, then you're going to get bias. And that calculation there, that thing that goes into that conditional redshift distribution, it consists of a few parts. It consists of the likelihood of observing a particular color at a given redshift, which is physics. That tells you, that's determined by how galaxies produce stars at various redshifts and how those stars grow and evolve. The second term is about the prior probability of observing a source at any particular redshift, and that's to do with the observing strategy and the sources that go into your cosmic shear survey. And the third term is to do with the amount of sources as a function of color, the covariate probability distribution as a function of color. And if any of those three things differ between the calibration sample and the wide field shear sample, you're in trouble. And so how can this happen? How can things differ? Well, the probability of a source being at a given redshift in a single cell of color is given by this conditional distribution that we saw here. And let's take a cartoony picture that I've given down here. So we have redshift on the x-axis and color on the y-axis. And this green box is one single color cell of my self-organizing map. And you can see that this particular color cell consists of green galaxies at low redshift and blue galaxies at high redshift and no red galaxies at high redshift. So this is the makeup of our cell. And if we were to look now at how that compares to the makeup of the same cell, but now not only with imaging, but with the spectroscopic redshift distribution, but of the spectroscopic sample of sources, then what we might see is that selection effects in the spectroscopic sample create a modification to that redshift distribution, to that source conditional redshift distribution in our particular cell. And the reason for that is one of two effects that are variously called covariate shift and prior probability shift. Now, these mean basically the same things, just viewed in a different causality, but essentially is to say that selection effects applied to one sample mean that it is no longer representative of the other sample. And in this case, what's happened is a selection effect has been applied on the redshift axis here. That means that this sample of blue galaxies doesn't appear in my cell for the calibration sources. And what that means is that when I construct the conditional redshift distribution for this particular cell in the wide field sample, which I don't know, and the calibration sample that I do know, there's a systematic difference. And that systematic difference then folds through into our estimate of the redshift distribution calculation and creates bias. Now, the question is, does that bias cause problems for a survey like Euclid? Now, this bias comes in three terms. It comes in this format here with the first term, which is known as covariate shift, which refers to when the distribution of colors between the training sample and the target sample, SPECT sample and photometric sample differ. It comes in this flavor of prior probability shift, where the prior redshift distribution of the two samples differ. And it comes in this format here as concept drift, where the actual conditional distribution functions are just fundamentally different. At the end of the day, for our purposes in cosmic shear, in calibration of redshift distributions, these three effects all have the same end result, which is that this conditional function doesn't agree between the calibration sample and the shear sample, and that creates bias. So for a survey like Euclid, does this bias, with the current methods that we have for calculating redshift distributions, cause problems for science? Well, it will if these effects persist below the cell level, because above the cell level on a self-organizing map and with our various methods, we've created methods of redshift calibration that are relatively robust to these effects. And for current surveys, it turns out that these effects are well under control. But if these effects persist below the cell level, as in my example from the last slide, then that creates problems. Is this a problem for stage 4? Yes.
The answer, so what I've got done here is I've created a very simplistic simulation, which has a realistically complex spectroscopic calibration sample shown in red, a realistically complex wide field shear sample shown in blue, and I've assumed that Euclid and LSST will have no photometric noise. So these are perfect model magnitudes for all sources. What you can see on the right here is what I call a ridgeline diagram, which is essentially just taking each individual cell of my self-organizing map, rank ordering it by the true mean redshift of that cell, shown as the mean of the blue ridge, of the blue histograms. And then I've rank ordered them and then plotted them on a stack plot. And you can see it forms this ridgeline. The crucial thing to interpret from this diagram is that using perfect photometry, these N of Z, these individual probability distributions of redshift per cell, are not delta functions. They have some intrinsic width, and that intrinsic width allows this error as a function of cell, this bias per cell within the cell, to creep in, and that can create problems. These biases creep in because the sample of the calibration data, or the selection of the calibration data, differs from the selection of the wide field data. In a real machine learning application, if you're using machine learning, these effects persist in essentially every single data set. And they are a natural outcome of the complexity of differing samples. What is the effect of these differing selection functions for the calibration of a Euclid-like survey? Well, it means that you can't do the science. That's an inflammatory statement. I'm going to run with it. What you can see here is a distribution of the mean bias of individual SOM cells given my noiseless Euclid and LSST surveys as a function of the true redshift of the cells the true redshift of the SOM cells. And what you can see is the individual points here are individual cells, the amount of bias in individual cells. These individual cells are catastrophically biased. But even if you just look at ensembles of cells, which are what we would think of as tomographic bins in cosmic shear, these individual groups of associations are themselves fundamentally biased at particular redshift points, right? For example, at 0.7-ish here. That level of bias is catastrophic for Euclid and therefore is not suitable. So what can we do about this? Well, the first thing you can do about it is you can try and forward model all of the selection functions that go into your various calibration samples. And this is what we tried to do in stage 3 surveys when validating the redshift distribution calculations for surveys like the dark energy survey shown on the left and KIDS shown on the right. Now, what I'm showing here on the left is the uncertainty budget of the redshift distribution calibration for the dark energy survey's year 3 analysis. And what I'm showing you on the right is the estimates of redshift distribution calculations in simulations that we've computed using realistically complex simulations. And if you're interested in this sort of work, then you'll be very interested in the talk by Jan-Luca van den Busch, who's talking exclusively about KIDS redshift calibration during one of the sessions here at the meeting. So please go check that out. The important point here is that you can use realistically complex forward modeling provided that you jointly simulate all expected systematic effects that go into both the calibration and wide field data sets to estimate the amount of bias, this covariate shift and prior probability shift between the calibration and wide field data sets. And therefore you can use this as an estimate of the amount of bias that you would have on real data and propagate that through. The other method you could do that doesn't involve simulations would be to try and debias individual cells using population statistics. This turns out to be difficult. And it turns out to be difficult for a number of reasons that I won't go into at length, but there was a paper by Olivier Hilbert and collaborators last year who demonstrated that with a sufficiently deep and sufficiently high fidelity photometric calibration sample and spectroscopy following a Cosmos-like sample, or even better, a C3R2 complete calibration of the color redshift relation like sample, then you end up with the ability to debias individual SOM cells, and that can lead to redshift distributions that reside within the requirements of Euclid and LSST, which is what you can see by these little yellow regions here. And you can see that if you're using a SOM with the dark energy survey depth imaging, then you almost get there. And if you're using a SOM C3R2-like calibration sample with LSST depth imaging, then you end up getting basically within the requirements for Euclid, provided you can do this debiasing accurately. This is a data side method, which is good. And the last thing that you can do, which is also important or also very useful, is you can just leverage multiple estimation techniques. So one of the main ways that people are looking at doing redshift distribution calibration for cosmic shear surveys going forward in stage 4 is using joint measurements of things of clustering redshifts, for example, which is what I'm showing here on the left, which is not using the same color information as is used in a SOM-based approach. The argument being that if the selection functions that go into the calibration sample for a non-color-based approach are fundamentally different to the selection functions that go into the color-based approach, then provided your estimates agree with one another, your calibration is robust. Now, this is the mechanism that we've been using for validating redshift distributions in the kilodegree survey for stage 3. And there are papers out recently, such as Stolzner et al. Came out only last month, which is talking about how whether or not you can combine and leverage doing both clustering-based measurements together with photometric-based measurements like the SOM in order to jointly estimate the best fitting redshift distribution. So please go check out that paper. It's very interesting. So this is my summary slide. At the end of the day, what this is telling us is that at the accuracy required of a survey like Euclid for stage 4, the sub-SOM cell selection effects are going to be sufficiently complicated and sufficiently complex that they create biases in the redshift distributions that are calibrated for Euclid that are beyond the requirements that we have for the survey. And that means that we're going to need to create more comprehensive methods that are better able to deal with these various selection effects by either forward modeling or doing something clever on the data side, or by leveraging multiple differing approaches with different systematic effects simultaneously in order to reach the requirements of Euclid.
So thank you very much for listening to my talk. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me on Slack or come to the discussion session where we can discuss things live. I'd like to finish by telling people about a side project I've been working on where I found a rather elegant solution to the Hubble tension. I found that on the data side, if you make a few relatively simple selections, then what you can do is alleviate all tensions. And all you have to do is apply a very simplistic cut to